We were doing a series on work. Gary was a fellow that hated his work. He was trying to find another job. He couldn't find another job. And one Friday morning, the alarm clock went off, and he just sort of had it. And but then he realized that his boss had told him he wasn't going to be in the next day on Friday. And Gary hit the snooze alarm and overslept and decided he was going to miss work too. His boss would never know. He had a leisurely breakfast, called some of his friends to play golf in the afternoon. At 1 o'clock, he was teeing off. About 4 o'clock, he got a phone call on his cell from his boss. And the boss said, hey, Gary, I just want to check in. How's work going today? And Gary said, that's fantastic. Everybody's highly motivated. Things are humming here. In fact, it's been so busy, I haven't had a break all day. The boss said, that's great, Gary. Hey, listen, can I ask you a favor? He said, sure, boss, anything. He said, could you guys speed it up? We're in the foursome right behind you. We are doing a series on the value of work. And today, we're looking at what does the Bible say about patterns of success at work? And there are three things that I would like to highlight today. Work motivation, work effort, and work relationships. Those three things: work, motivation, work effort, and work relationships. The first part is work motivation. And the Bible gives us as Christians a unique opportunity to be motivated like other people aren't. There are two things that I want to mention here: that we are employees of Christ. Ultimately, when God looks at your work and my work as Christians, we do have a boss that he or she that we report to. However, from God's point of view, we are also serving Jesus Christ through our work. Now, when I think about this, I think about, everyone has probably served or been employed by a bad boss. And sometimes a bad boss is just one of those, he just doesn't seem to give enough attaboys. He's slow to give you praise or thanks. He gives you projects with too little of a deadline, expects you to work late with short notice. Those are not uncommon things in the work world. Or sometimes you get a boss where there's just a lot of pressure and deadlines, and every day is just kind of filled with this stress thing. Well, Paul tells us there's a higher boss that you work for that could be a different source of motivation than what we normally think is our boss's job to help motivate us. Colossians 3:22 says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. Do it, not only when their eye is on you to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men, since you know you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Now, that's an amazing picture of motivation about our boss. Now, you think, well, Seth, you don't work for a boss like I do. My boss, it's so demotivating. The culture at our work is so demotivating. I just hate going to work. Are you telling me that I can have a different motivation even in that situation? Well, I think Paul would answer that question by rereading the verse and looking at who this particular instruction is given for. Let's go back to verse 22. Slaves. Now, in that culture, like most of the world, there was slavery going on, and he's not endorsing slavery, obviously. The Bible doesn't do that. But for people who find themselves in that position and can do nothing to extricate themselves from that, either by chattel slavery, or sometimes slavery was a way of paying off debts for a 5-year debt or a 7-year debt, and you were free. But if you're in a situation in your work that's worse than slavery, then maybe you might have a question with Paul. But I have a feeling that at 5 or 6 o'clock most days, you get to go home. You get to cook what you want for dinner. You get to turn on the TV and watch a show. You get to get on your phone and talk to people. If you're a slave, you don't get to do any of those things. So even in the worst possible work environment, Paul says, even there, what you are doing, you serve Christ. It's a different motivation. Then, what the Bible tells us is there's two kinds of motivation, both extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic motivation is the thing we're most often aware of, and I work for a paycheck, I work for a raise, I work to try to get a promotion, I'm working to try to get out of this job and into a better job, upward mobility. I'm trying to please the boss. All of these are extrinsic motivations, but there's also intrinsic motivation. Now, it's easy to come up with a list of extrinsic motivations. But when you think about intrinsic motivations, that's a little bit harder list to come up with. And this is what Paul addresses here in these verses again. Notice these same verses, Colossians 3:22 and forward. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart, reverence for the Lord. Now, what he's implying here is that we work for favor of the master or the boss, and that's not a bad thing, but we could be working for his favor, he's implying here. With sincerity of heart, reverence for the Lord, whatever you do, work with all your heart as working for the Lord, since you know you will receive an inheritance. The two extrinsic motivations he mentions here, he implies favor for the Lord, and he promises there's a reward coming at the end of the day, at the end of our life, for what we work. But he also talks about three intrinsic motivation, or two intrinsic motive, three. Sincerity of heart, reverence for the Lord, and working for the Lord and not men. When it comes to motivation, the question to ask ourselves is, on what basis am I really sort of relying on for my motivation at work? Am I relying on extrinsic motivation from my boss or a work culture or the people I work with? Or is there a different, higher extrinsic motivation? And what about intrinsic motivation? Is it possible to have a higher intrinsic motivation and not be so determined by the work culture or the boss with which I work? Now, that's the first thing that when I think about work and what the Bible says about our motivation. But motivation alone is not enough when it comes to work. Like we talked about last week, work also is meant to be hard, and our challenge is to be diligent, to toil and to labor. These are not unusual things, but this is by design. I'm reminded of the story of Fred, who was a farmer, and he moved across state lines, and he bought an old, dilapidated farm. And I mean, it had been abandoned years before. The farmhouse had a hole in the roof. The paint was peeling off the outside of this farmhouse. The landscape in front of the house was a wreck. The fields were filled with weeds, and when Fred looked at where the pens used to be, the fences were all dilapidated. But he got a great price on this, and he bought the farm. A couple days after he moved there, the local preacher came out to meet Fred, and they talked and chatted a while, welcomed him to the state and to this part of the country, and the preacher said, "Let me pray for you." And so he prayed that between Fred and God, that they would build an amazing farm here that would be a blessing to Fred, his family, the people around, and would be the light to show the light of Christ. About 3 months later, the preacher came back out to visit, and when he drove up, he was astounded at what he saw. He noticed that the farmhouse, instead of a hole in the roof, had a whole new roof. And the front, instead of peeling paint, had been redone and was just stunning, and he had redone the landscape. It just looked like a show place. And then he looked at the pens, and the fences had been repaired, and instead of just blank space in there, there were some small herds that were grazing on feed. And then he looked out at the fields, and instead of weeds, he noticed that Fred had done some spring planting and had row after straight rows of vegetables that were coming up after 3 months of being in the ground. And he was just astounded. Well, Fred came out. He saw him. Fred came out, and the preacher was talking to Fred, and he said, "Wow," the preacher said, "You know, Fred, you and God have done such an amazing place. You've such amazing work with this place." He said, "Well, preacher, yeah, I guess that's right, but you better remember something. Remember what this place was like when only God was working the farm." It's one thing to have good work motivation. It's another thing to put in work effort and diligence. On the inside of your handout, The second thing that we look at is work effort, energy. We exert effort. Work doesn't just take effort, but it also requires energy. There's outside effort, but there's also an inside energy that the Bible talks about. Proverbs 12:14 says, "From the fruit of his lips, a man is filled with good things as surely as the work of his hands rewards him." Now, this little phrase, the work of his hands, in the Hebrew language means energy or energetic. What he's talking about here in Proverbs is both an internal energy that's going on and an outward effort that's being made in this person's actions. Energy. Think about some of the different workplaces you've been in. If you're a boss and you have an employee that's just not very energetic, over time, what is the effect of that lack of energy upon you as the boss? You don't think, no matter how well they do, you don't think about promotion or a raise or giving them more responsibility. Because even though they may do the work, if there's not something coming out of them, some type of energy, it doesn't catch your attention. It's just not quite enough that's being produced. Or maybe think about, what effect does somebody without energy have to do with the company? I wonder what it'd be like if you were an energetic worker with other employees, fellow employees. And what it would be like to being adding water so that other boats float a little bit higher in the water because of you. Energy. That comes from energy, from an attitude, something inside of you. Or if for no other higher reason than the lowest, for your own benefit, what does energy bring? You say, well, Seth, I just don't have that much energy when I don't like work. Well, duh. Energy is something that starts with you. If you are waiting for somebody else to provide energy in you, you're going to be waiting a long, long time. Energy is something that you have to decide in your heart that you are going to generate, no matter what the work environment be. Ecclesiastes 9 says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the grave where you are going, there is neither working nor planning nor knowledge nor wisdom." This is it. This is our life here. Do it with all of your might. He's not just talking about outward work, but something inward. And then there are three little categories, subcategories of this that Proverbs talks about. Labor. Proverbs 14:23. "In all toil there is profit, but mere talk tends only to want." Talking a good game is easy to do. Playing a good game is something that requires toil. Hard work, Proverbs 14:23. "All hard work brings a profit. Mere talk tends only to poverty." Hard work is a euphemism for the Hebrew word toil. Diligence, which we looked at last week, Proverbs 13:4. "The sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied." This word diligent is a popular word in the book of Proverbs. The Hebrew word is a strange word for us, sharutz. Sharutz. I need more sharutz when I go to work. Sharutz. The Hebrew word in the original means sharply pointed. Think about the meaning of this word, diligent. Sharply pointed. Or we might use the English word incisive. It figures out what needs to be done and it puts itself to the task. Incisive. It came to have a broader meaning of persevering or being a person of earnest. We don't use that word much in our culture anymore, but a person of earnest. So that has to do with our work motivation and our work effort. The last one is our work relationships. And this is not something that we normally just naturally think about when we think about work. It's easy to think about the work effort and trying to get the results that I'm supposed to be doing and the motivation about work. But this last one tends to be just sort of a kind of a throw-in, I think, for most of us. There are people I know that are proficient in their work. and they work hard, and they are highly motivated to work. And yet, through the course of their life, they find themselves dealing with people problems as a pattern wherever they go. Now, because there are people out there fallen like me, that should not be a surprise. But if you have a pattern of persistent people problems, this last thing is probably the thing to think about the most from this particular message. Work relationships, and there are two things I'd like to highlight from the Bible here. The first is goodwill. Creating goodwill. Goodwill does not just happen at work. It has to be generated and created. And the good news is goodwill creates trust, or it builds trust. Proverbs 11:27, he who seeks goodwill. It doesn't just happen because I showed up. The first few weeks at work, it's kind of the honeymoon period, the first month or so, but eventually over time, the honeymoon part wears off and you kind of gravitate back to who you are. And the people you work with and the boss gravitate to who they really are also. You may have the beginning of goodwill at the beginning, kind of like honeymoon and marriage, but eventually you have to create goodwill yourself. And goodwill produces trust. Now, how does this happen? Goodwill is demonstrated again and again and again and again over a long period of time and becomes a pattern in terms of how people see you, how they think of you. You may have all kinds of things that you hope that they see in you, but eventually they're going to see what they see and draw conclusions based upon the decisions you make, the reactions that you have to different work situations, your attitudes about work, your words, and your general life. All five of these things, people draw conclusions about you, and you either create a high amount of goodwill or a low amount of goodwill, and with that, a high amount of trust with your boss and your fellow employees and the people that work for you, or you can create a low level of trust with your boss and your fellow employees and those who work for you. Goodwill and trust are like money in the bank. If Mindy asks, how much, Seth, do we have in our checking account? And I told her, we have $10,000 in our checking account. She might go, wow. But if she went online and on our Wells Fargo account and found out that we only have $10 in our checking account, who's right? The bank is right. It doesn't matter how much I think is in the bank. What matters is how much does Wells Fargo think is in our checking account and in our savings account. Goodwill and trust are just like this. You have to create it over a long period of time as a pattern. The second element here is gracious speech, what Proverbs calls gracious speech. I love this first verse in this section because it highlights both work effort and relationship. Our second and third points, work effort and relationships. From the fruit of his lips, a man is filled with good things. Here he's talking about relationships, the words that we use when we're talking to the boss, fellow employees, and those that work for us. From the fruit of his lips, a man is filled with good things, as surely as the work of his hands, our efforts, our actions, rewards him. He sees a parallel here between effort and reward from our work and the fruit of our lips. How we talk to people, how we relate to people in the work environment has a chance to either create goodwill and trust or not. Proverbs 13:13, and here are some verses in your handout that I thought, these are the kind of goodwill things that are killers that are often seen in the workplace. Proverbs 13:13. He who scorns instruction will pay for it, but he who respects the command is rewarded. Scorn. Scorn is one of those things that happens when the boss tells you to do something and internally you roll your eyes and you think to yourself, right. Now, that may not be seen by the boss, particularly if the boss is not very sensitive. But where this is often seen is in the workroom or the lunchroom when employees go out and they talk about the boss or they talk about the work environment. And scorn is one of those things that just comes to our mind. Can you believe what she wanted me to do? Can you believe what he said to me? Can you believe when he wants this done? It just drips out of us like honey on a honeycomb. He who scorns instructions will pay for it. And where it's paid for eventually is in goodwill. Because those who hear you scorning are learning something about you. If you will scorn the boss, who won't you scorn? You are dependent upon your boss for a paycheck and for a job. And even if you leave the job for a good reference, and you'll even scorn him or her, they learn something about you with scorn. A gentle answer, and the opposite, he who respects a command is rewarded. How you respond to the boss, both in the boss's presence and when you're with other people, either creates goodwill or it slowly erodes it. Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. A quick response, a blast of anger, also takes away goodwill. Proverbs 20, verse 3, it is one's honor to avoid strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel. What creates bad will here? The drive to have to be right. The one in the know, the one that has it right, the one that's thought this through. When that happens, if you relate like that, well, you know what it's like when people relate to you. If your husband or wife relates that way, or somebody, the boss, relates to you, it's so discouraging. You just kind of throw up your hands and say, whatever. Goodwill is lost in this particular thing. It is one's honor to avoid strife. You can't avoid strife always. There's always going to be conflict, but sometimes we create our own strife by the need, the drive to have to be the smartest one in the room or around the table. Proverbs 12:16. Fools show their annoyance at once, but the prudent overlook an insult. You may not do this with the boss, but if you do this around fellow employees, when you're out to lunch or in the workroom or having coffee, people learn about you, the real you. And if you'll do this with your boss when he's not around, what would you say about them when they're not around? Goodwill that could have been created is lost. And then people wonder, why do I not have goodwill? Why do I continue to have people issues wherever I go to work? The Bible would say two things to us. Are you creating goodwill? Or are you punching holes in your goodwill by some of these other verses here instead of gracious speech? When I thought about this, I thought, I jotted down 5 things where I see this probably the most. And I mentioned one of them is the drive to have to be right. If you find that welling up with inside of you at work this week, that is an effort to have to kill. Usually that's motivated by our own ego. We want to feel better about ourselves. It comes at a great cost to goodwill. The second one is sarcasm. I'm a guy that grew up in a sarcastic family. And I mean, all 5 of us, we walked around with guns in our holsters. Mom, dad, brother, sister, and yours truly. And we just used sort of what we all thought were funny barbs with each other until somebody got offended or hurt by something. And then the killer was always, what's the matter? Can't take a joke? Well, it wasn't until I got married that I realized that sarcasm is a lot more complicated than I thought. That over time, sarcasm, with even the most secure people, starts to take an effect. It starts to just chip away a little bit at goodwill, at respect, at honor. That can happen in a marriage. It can happen at work. It can happen with your own attitude, sarcasm. So about, 3 months into my marriage, I thought, when I'm using sarcasm towards Mindy, she used to think that was funny, but it doesn't appear that she really thinks that's funny anymore. And I was sort of thinking, maybe I need to say goodbye to sarcasm. And I thought, but sarcasm has been my friend for so many years. It's like saying goodbye to an old friend. And so I thought, well, maybe I can still use sarcasm at my own expense, which is what I did, 41 years ago or so. And this is what you all know, if you know me well, as self-deprecating humor. So sarcasm is still my friend, but it's aimed back at me. And everybody in the family gets a charge out of it when I use self-deprecating humor. Whenever there's a win and lose situation at work, where you're pressing for a win that you think you have to have and somebody else loses, you are losing goodwill. When you find yourself trying to impress somebody at work, there's a good chance that goodwill is going to be eroding, because people sense something in you, in your attitude. There's something about this for you and not for the company or the best decision. And the last one is cutting people down. It's easy to cut down people. All of us have that temptation to do that. But we think that we're sort of safe if we cut down people who aren't present. It kind of makes us look good. And our friends kind of laugh along. But again, the message is sent. If you're a person that will cut down these people when they're not around, what will you do when we're not around? And what's left is, instead of thinking you have $10,000 in your goodwill bank with people, you may actually have only $10. And then wonder, how come I seem to have so many people problems at work as a pattern in different jobs? Work motivation, work energy, both inward and outward, and work effort, or relationships. When I think about this, I think about the challenge of the gospel. And that in a sense, I thought of myself as sort of an employee years ago, as a creature, not a Christian, and certainly rebellious against God and not wanting to follow him, wanting to do my own thing. And if God wanted me to obey him, as long as I agreed with what he was asking, I would do that. But if I didn't agree with it, I wasn't going to do that. And in that sense, I was sort of like a rebellious employee who still had his paycheck, still went into work, still had the benefits of being a creature and God's goodwill towards me. And in our three illustrations here, God demonstrated the three things that we are talking about today with work. He continued to be motivated for my best effort. My well-being, both eternally and in this life. He was not deterred or demotivated by my unresponsiveness and my rebellion. He continued to pursue me. There was an internal motivation of love and long suffering and patience with me that finally began to make a difference at age 20, but has also still been exerted on his part over the last 47 years. He loves me in spite of me. There's work effort, and the work effort, of course, is seen through the whole Old Testament and the prophets and the Word of God back in Noah, or the days of Moses, all the way through the Old Testament, 1,500 years, all the way up until the Messiah comes and the cross that we sang about this morning and the resurrection. It took tremendous work on God's part to redeem people like me. And then the last thing is work relationships. He's had to work with God the Son, God the Spirit, God the Father, all three working together in concert. And he's had to work through people in my life who have been instrumental in shaping me over these many years. I think about Harold Bullock and Larry Crabb particularly. And then along the way, there are some of the folks in our church who have been here a while. Many of you have had an influence upon me in some way or some form or fashion. Romans 5:8 says, "But God demonstrated his love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." He's done for us far more than what we are encouraged to do in our work world when we go back in tomorrow through this week. We see it in his work motivation, his work effort, and his work relationships. Let's pray together. What a wondrous example we have in what you've called us to do regarding work, to create a pattern of success. What an amazing example we have as you have dealt with us. If your motivation had been determined based upon our response, you would have a long time ago said, you want to go your own way? Fine, go that way. Good luck with that. Or maybe your work effort would have stopped after just several prophets and said, just going to let the world go to hell because it's just determined to do that anyway. And the work relationships could have easily soured based on our attitudes towards you and towards your people. And yet the clearest picture we have of your work with us is to take a gaze at the cross and to see Jesus Christ, who loved us enough to die for us, to bear our sin and shame both in our past, our present, and that which is to come this week and following weeks and months. Because you love your people, you love us, and desire a relationship with us. Maybe you've never really given your life to Christ. It's really about surrender. You know, God, I realize that I keep trying to do what's right and I keep messing up. I keep trying to do this. Well, welcome to the club. This is what the Bible calls, I am a sinner by nature. And what we are called to do again and again and again is simply surrender our will to God and ask Jesus to come into our life and to sit in the throne of our life and to be the Lord of our life. And then each day to live that out as best we can, sometimes stumbling and bumbling our way forward. Maybe you just need to pray a simple prayer like this. Lord Jesus, I don't know much about this thing, Christianity. Or maybe you've assumed you're a Christian all this time. And maybe even right now you think, I don't even think I am one. That was true for me at age 20. And you simply say to God, I know I'm a sinner, but I thank you that Jesus died on the cross for me because he loves me. And all of that is forgiven. And I can be cleansed and be made new. Jesus, come in and sit on the throne of my heart today. Help me to walk with you.